One of the most wretched haunted house stories is from the year 1912. And what makes the story so wretched is that the story is true. On June 10th, 1912, Josiah and Sarah Moore were stabbed to death inside of their home in Villisca, Iowa. It was just like any night, and both Sarah and Josiah were in the house with their 4 children and 2 friends who were spending the night. Unfortunately, they were all killed. To this day, the crime remains a mystery. Nobody really knows who killed them, what killed them, and why. Were they just a random target, or was there some reason? No matter what reason, there was no justifying the horrible murders that took place inside the Moore home on that horrifying night back in June 10th, 1912. The Moore's home is considered to be one of the most haunted houses in the United States of America. But just like most paranormal experiences that happened in certain places and murders and hauntings, there are always certain people drawn to them places. People pay $400 to stay for one night inside the Moore home. There have been paranormal tours, but they have been cut short by children's voices, falling lamps, moving ladders, and flying objects, says the Villisca Axe Murder House website. One of the worst events that had happened in the house since the murders was when a paranormal investigator stabbed himself after spending the night. As the Villisca Axe Murder House website states, skeptics have left believers. Let me tell you a story that happened to me one night, and there are others to confirm it also. It was just an ordinary night shift. I normally like working on night shift because I am a bit of a night owl, so I don't mind staying up late at night. But one night things became really strange, and what I mean by strange is an understatement. I mean extraordinarily strange. You will see as you watch the story. Let me start at the beginning. It was a Friday night and I was working the night shift in my local hospital. I was just relaxing in the reception, reading a great book, when suddenly a man burst in the door. He was carrying a woman and shouted, "Help! Help! I saw this woman on the road. She's about to have a baby." I said, "Sir, who is this woman? I need to put her details into the system, but don't worry, we will get her to the labour ward right away." A few minutes later, the lady was put on a stretcher and put into the labour ward. She kept screaming and screaming. The man didn't know who she was, as he just picked her up on the road, and the doctors and nurses couldn't get anything out of her. Suddenly, a photograph fell out of the woman's hand, and it was of her and another woman. There was the name Claire Jackson on the back. I heard them say her name, and out of curiosity and trying to solve the mystery of who the woman was, I researched her. Claire was taken away from her mother due to her mother suffering from delusions of being the Messiah to a Dark Lord. She was taken away into the asylum, rambling about a satanic ritual performed to summon a Dark Lord that would be born on November 22nd. I froze when I read that date, as I was reading that article exactly on November the 22nd, suddenly the screaming grew louder. I ran into the labour ward, and the lady had given birth. The whole hospital got covered in a dark mist. The woman stopped screaming and gave a sinister smile, and the baby looked up at us with bright, red, evil-looking eyes that shone through the dark mist. Now that I've told you the story, let me tell you the weirdest, strangest thing. That woman walked out of the hospital that night with her baby and was never to be seen again. We checked CCTV footage and we were all around the bed where the woman was, but the baby and woman weren't anywhere to be seen on any of the CCTV footage. But we know what we saw, and we know that we didn't imagine it. How could so many of us have imagined it? But the question I ask is, if that baby is a Dark Lord, when will it make its presence known? Every day I worry that the room I'm in will get covered in that black mist. This is more of a vent post than a story. I have an unusual condition where I randomly age to any number. Some days I might be an old man, and other days I might be a baby. My parents did their best to give me the best life they could offer. I couldn't go to school all of the time because I would wake up completely old at a height of 6'2", while the night before I was just a crying baby. There are times I would wake up at the right healthy ages, from 15 to 45, and that's just my opinion. My dad would promise me to take me somewhere fun as I was a child. Then the next day I would age up to an old man again, and all I wanted to do was watch the news. I wish I could just age in order like everyone else. I don't care if it was young to old or old to young, because random aging is just terrible. At the moment you could be at the prime age of being in your 20s, while the next day you could end up as a crying baby again. People found me as a crying baby on the street, and also as an old homeless man on the bench who was nearing to death. I just want to be normal. Many different types of people like me at different ages. Mothers or women who want to become pregnant like me as a baby, while old folk like me when I am old, and the present generation like me in the prime ages of being in my 20s, 30s and 40s. I was once kidnapped as a baby, and then the kidnapper let me go a day later, as I ended up aging to a man in my 30s. A day later I found myself in an old people's home, as I had randomly aged to an old man in my 90s. Then a day later I walked out of the old people's home as a rebellious teenager. I just want to age normally, in order where I could plan things. It's impossible to plan anything in my condition, as in one moment I could be an old man, and the next day I could go back to being a baby. There is nothing out there. If this is depressing, then I am sorry. Siobhan was looking forward to spending Halloween night with her parents and friends Sarah and Lydia. Her parents had to drive home from town first, as they were collecting a new car her dad just bought. Sarah and Lydia were killing the time playing computer games, but they soon got bored. It was then Siobhan decided to get out a Ouija board to them fool around with. She had it as a gift from last Christmas, but didn't play it until now. She knew how to use it though, because of watching people use it in movies. When they were all sitting around the table, Siobhan asked, "Who's there?" The board spelled out, "Siobhan." "Oh no, Siobhan." Siobhan asked, "Are you dead?" The planchet moved around the board, spelling out, "Yes." Then Siobhan asked, "How were you killed?" The board spelled out, "Car accident." Then Siobhan was getting spooked out completely and asked who was this, and the board spelled out, "Your mother." Siobhan sat back shocked while her two friends thought it was some sick joke. Sarah said, "That was sick, Siobhan. Why would you do that? You obviously were moving the thing around the board. Why say that about your own parents?" Siobhan said, "I wasn't messing. That was moving by itself." Siobhan rang her mom and there was no answer. Then she rang her dad. There was no answer. Suddenly there was a knock on the door and Siobhan was hoping it was her parents, but her heart sank when it was the police. Siobhan knew the policeman as he was a friend of her dad's. He had a sad face on him and said, "I am very sorry to break this news to you, Siobhan, but unfortunately your parents were killed in a car accident."
We had heard about the sickness for weeks. Rumors of people dropping in the streets, being run over by carriages and left to rot. No one would touch them for fear of being infected. In just hours, whole villages were seeing symptoms, hundreds dead in days. I lived in a small farming village with my mother and father. We were secluded where we lived. There were only 4 houses spread over 20 miles. People from the cities would drift by on their way to safety and tell us what they'd heard about the fever. But no one else came after a while. Not even the mailman. A week, a month, 2 months passed, and we hadn't seen a soul. My father and mother decided to leave, but I told them I couldn't come. The family that lived on the last farm east was very dear to us, and they had small children. I told my mother I would go to see if they were okay and ask if they would come with me. After that, I would follow my parents south to where my aunt lived. Mother cried, but I would not be swayed. I watched them leave as the sun rose over the dirt road. I had a 20-mile walk in front of me, and so I began. There are those who doubt my story after this point. Some say I'm simply lying. Others speculate I had the fever and what I saw was only in my mind. I know I wasn't sick. I wish it was all a terrible hallucination, but I know what happened was real. It is midnight on the 3rd of November, 1723. I am a condemned woman. I am scheduled to be hanged in the morning. I have no reasons left to lie. This document will be seen only after I'm dead. Let this be my last testament. As I walked the path, I noticed a distinct silence in the trees. Sounds I had heard all my life were simply gone. And then I heard her. She was coming down the path. A smile arched across her face. She moved lightly, almost skipping. Not a care in the world. A large crimson stain sat dark at the frayed neck of her dress. Blood. "Are you okay, miss?" I asked as she passed by. It wasn't until she was only inches from me that I recognized her. The look in her eyes and that terrible smile made it hard for me to notice at first, but now I could see it was Mrs. Shannon. She lived on the farm closest to ours. She had never been one to smile. She didn't look at me when I talked to her, only continued to sing. I assumed then that she had the illness and her mind was gone. I watched her for a few minutes and then turned and kept going. After about a minute, I looked back. She stood about 100 yards away with her back to me. Her head was turned sideways, listening. I ran the rest of the way. I arrived at the house just as the sun began to set. I knew something was wrong as soon as I laid my eyes on it. There were no cows in the pasture, no goats. I jogged to the front door and knocked. Nothing inside moved. Flies buzzed in the kitchen where dirty dishes sat out exposed. Maggots slithered on the plates, finishing what was left of a week-old dinner. A trail of blood led to the back of the house where the bedrooms were. I moved slowly. The smell was even worse here. Mr. Peters lay on the floor beside the bed. His neck was torn and blood had pooled black beneath him. He'd been dead for days. Something moved in the closet. I hadn't seen the children. I had to check. Though I have to admit at this point I was terrified. I tried to keep quiet as I opened the door. It was the eldest, James. He was cowering in the corner. I took him to his room and gave him some of the water and food I had brought. I asked him what happened. He told me the whole story. A few weeks ago, a drifter had come to town with a fever. Mrs. Shannon let him stay in her barn. He told her it wasn't the illness that made him sick now, but that he had been attacked by a vampire on the road. She thought he was delirious. After he died, she and her husband buried him in the cemetery. A few days later, Mr. Shannon told his wife he had seen the man outside. The drifter said he needed his shoes. They had fallen off while they were transporting his body. After a few moments, the man left. For the next few days, they were plagued by knocks at their door during the night. One of these nights, Mr. Shannon had enough. He went out with his gun and told the man he would shoot him if he didn't go. The man began to laugh hysterically. Mrs. Shannon didn't see what happened, but when morning came, she went out and saw her husband dead on the ground. James told me that a few days prior to my arriving, Mrs. Shannon came asking for help. She said her husband had crawled out of his grave and was trying to get into the house. James's parents turned her away, thinking she was either sick or telling the truth. Either way, they were too scared to open the door. Mrs. Shannon returned not long after. That big grin, those wild eyes, she smelled of rot. She would come in the night, sing songs outside their windows. He told me his 8-year-old sister Elizabeth was the first to die. For reasons no one could understand, she had gone out of bed just before dawn and walked outside. He remembers having dreamt of a girl screaming for help. When he awoke, he realized the sounds were real. They found her a few hours later, sitting against a tree, a few yards into the woods. All the joints in her body had been twisted the wrong way. Before they buried her, his father bound her broken wrists with a rope and salted the earth above her. After a few days of hiding in the house, they ran out of supplies and decided to leave. His mother was killed while trying to gather goats. James and his father took their guns and searched the woods for the vampire, but there was no sign of it. They left her body where it fell and followed the road north. When night came, they found themselves surrounded. They would hear laughter coming from the forest and running feet cutting across the path behind them. James swears he heard his mother calling for him to come into the woods. In a panic, they headed back to the house. His father was briefly attacked along the way, and by the time they got inside, he was just barely breathing. I asked James if he knew who it was that had killed his father, and he told me it was his sister, 6 days after she died. In the end, I decided it didn't matter if it was true or not. James was weak and needed help. There were still usable supplies at my house. We had to leave. It's safer in the day, he told me. He wouldn't budge. He wouldn't let me bury his father either, but at least he let me put the body outside. The silence was still palpable. There were no crickets, not even a gust of wind to make me feel better. It was as if someone had taken our little village and cut it out from the rest of the world. Before I went back inside, I scanned the tree line expecting to see only darkness. There was a small purple dress obscured by low branches near the edge of the forest. At first I was elated. I could tell it was Elizabeth. She was caked in dirt. I thought because she had gotten lost in the woods and finally found her way out. I took a few steps toward her. She returned the favor and started walking to me. Her bones were all broken. She limped across the road like a puppet on strings. Each step she took would tear a new piece of flesh or crack another bit of bone. With absolute horror, I studied her face. She only smiled and held out her arms to me, wrists still bound. I ran back inside. James and I barricaded ourselves in the back bedroom and waited. I turned the lantern down to just barely a spark. We sat in the dark and listened. We heard his mother calling outside. James, Mommy's waiting. I could see the tears dripping down his cheeks. Elizabeth put her eyes between the cracks in the wood. Don't you miss us, brother? James begged her to leave. She said she would, but first she had to tell him something. He leaned in near the wall and she whispered in his ear. Then she left as promised. James sat without saying a word. He picked up the lantern and raised the flame. I asked if he was okay. He opened the globe and poured the oil down his throat. In seconds, he was covered in flames. I screamed. I wanted to help him, but there was no way. The room was overcome in just moments. I rushed to escape. Smoke filled every inch of the space. I couldn't see, couldn't breathe. By the time I stumbled outside, it was almost dawn. I was so overcome by the smoke in my lungs that I lost consciousness. When I awoke, there was nothing left of the house or of James. A gash ran across my wrist. I had lost a lot of blood in the night, but I could still move. I tore a piece of my dress and wrapped the wound. When I could walk, I wandered north towards the closest town. Somewhere along the way, I heard the light and ringing of a tiny bell. I came across a cemetery and saw that the bell I was hearing was from a grave. Someone inside was pulling it, as if to say they had been buried alive. I walked to it, and as I did, another bell began to ring. Then another and another. I ran and never looked back. I thought I'd hurt my wrist while leaving the house, but now I realize that while I was unconscious lying on the grass, they fed. In a few hours, I'll be put to death for something I did not do. The people here think themselves civilized. They don't believe in monsters. I tried to warn them, but they won't listen, won't take precautions. They'll bury me tonight, and tomorrow morning, I'll be ringing my own bell.
Dig deeper at sessionsx.tumblr.com.